We see changes everywhere. Let's just look at the last 6 months. In April of 2009, immigration enforcement raided a workplace, arresting non-status people at the one place they were sure to be at work. 80 people were picked up, dragged away, and illegally deported. In June, Bill C-45 was passed, which meant that immigration enforcement could arbitrarily refuse somebody entry into the country. That same month, we saw the Mohawks of Akwesasne go up against immigration enforcement that tried to militarize the border. That same month, we saw a vicious attack on the refugee system that continued through July and August. Hell, Harper went to the G8 and talked about the Canadian refugee system. In October of this year, just last week, we saw new regulations put out on the temporary work program. Regulations that said that a person could come to this country, work for 4 years, but at the end of those 4 years, they had to be deported. They could not return into the country for another 6. In these times of economic recession, it seems that the government is doing everything but stepping up for migrants. There are bailouts for banks, there's bailouts for multinational corporations, and these corporations are making profit of the backs of migrants, reaping them of migrant labor. Kenney, one of the most vicious, xenophobic, racist immigration minister, head of the Immigration and Citizenship Ministry, formerly and perhaps more truthfully called the Immigration and Colonization Ministry, also happens to be extremely media savvy. Everywhere we look, we hear his lies. We hear that migrants are stealing Canadian citizens' jobs. We hear that the refugee system is fair and generous. We turn to the green movement, and it talks about buying locals, but somehow forget that this local food is being grown by migrant labor. We turn to the labor movement, and it talks about buying Canadian, but somehow that language is being mobilized by ignoring the struggles of migrant workers. It has become imperative that Kenney's lies and betrayal be exposed for what it truly is. The battle that lies ahead of us is a battle in the world of ideas. We all need to become spokespeople of another world. A world where these immigration changes are talked about in a much more truthful way. Because Canada is not some multicultural, lovey-dovey, diverse place, is it? 1/3 of the people on the street in the city happen to be newcomers. Our youth are being pushed out of schools. They're being attacked by the police. We see our communities underserved and underserviced. We see Canadian citizens who just happen to be Muslim and male and brown skinned, tortured in Syria and Sudan, in the United States, and in Kingston, and in Montreal, and in Toronto. These lies, this exclusion needs to be unmasked for what it is, and we all need to begin to speak out. Because what we see is a system that is moving towards a permanent temporariness. A permanent temporariness where migrant workers come here, they work here, but they cannot access health services, they cannot access food, they cannot get an education. And under these regulations, they will become permanently temporary. They will come here, work here for 4 years, and then be pushed away. And we have to organize to question these changes to the refugee system. Because today, Canadian mining companies displace 10 million people, while Canada only grants refugee status to 11,000. And when Kenney tells us, oh hey, this system is being cheated by bogus and legitimate refugees, what we need to ask ourselves, and him, and each other, and others, is that, is the question that Canada is some benevolent state that it is going to give homes to the wretched of the earth? Or does Canada include those that it has displaced? That is the question we've gathered here today to answer. And when the Toronto Star tells us that migrants are stealing jobs, we tell them no. People are doing jobs in conditions that should be illegal. At pay that should be banned, and corporations are making profits, and those corporations need to be charged. And when we're talking about a 4-year work permit, that 4-year work permit is not a work permit, it's a 4-year deportation order. Kenney is placing a time limit on the length of your relationships. Time limit on the amount of time you can have a friend, or live in a place, or have a future, or think far ahead. And we have to remember that there are actually deportations in this city. According to the Canadian press, there are 13,000 deportations. And for those of you who don't know how a deportation looks like, let me give you a sense. So tomorrow morning around 3 o'clock, white vans will leave Airport Road, the Greater Toronto Enforcement Centre, and sneak into the city. Guards, some of them armed, will run into people's houses, bang on doors, pull families out, throw them into a van, and drive them back to the Heritage and Detention Centre or the airport, the Greater Toronto Enforcement Centre, and over the next few days, they'll be put in a plane and thrown out. And there's 13,000 of those deportations that happen in this country. But there are other deportations. Because we need to start thinking about these things in the way they make sense to us and not in the way Kenney keeps telling us. Not in the way this immigration system keeps telling us. Because when an international student cannot get a job within 60 days and has to leave the country, that's a deportation. When an immigration officer sits a person who's just been denied their refugee claim, sits them down and is like, you have to leave or we're going to throw you into jail, and the person just voluntarily leaves, that is a deportation. When a temporary worker at the completion of their so-called contract is driven to the airport and involuntarily put onto a plane and they leave, that's a deportation. And if we start to include those numbers in the deportation, then the 13,000 number triples. Now we're talking about 30,000 people, the majority of whom happen to be in Toronto. That's approximately 78 deportations a day in the city every day. And this battle, as I say, this battle of ideas needs to begin to happen everywhere. We need to start asking ourselves, what kind of a world do we need to see? What kind of a just system is it that we're looking for? Because if immigration is by definition a system of exclusion, because it has to include and exclude somebody, we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that any system could be fair or just? Today, No One is Illegal Vancouver did a rally outside the Citizenship and Immigration Office. No One is Illegal Montreal found Jason Kenney going into McGill, surrounded him, started telling him how he's racist, started telling him how a Mexican woman just died in Mexico today, who tried to claim refugee status in this country twice. Do you know what he said? He said, fine, I'm racist, and he walked in. We have to start asking ourselves, what do we need to do to stop this? And so, our call is a call for status for all. And what is status? Status is an entitlement to very basic services. Food, education, health, social protection, dignity. And these are entitlements for all people. Not just people without status, not just people with status, but all people. And we have to start talking about how that's going to become a reality. How are we going to get status for all? How are we going to turn our health centers into places that are safe? How are we going to turn our schools into places that are safe? How are we going to turn our universities into places that are safe? We have to start talking about status for all. And that's why we've gathered here.